Document understanding process is a big part and an important part of an end-to-end automation. And our goal is to improve the experience for UiPath developers. As you know, UiPath Document Understanding represents the ability to extract information and meaning from a wide range of documents. In order to help you achieve this, UiPath has created the Document Understanding Framework, an open and extensible framework that can be customized to better suit everyone's needs. In summary, this is how the framework looks like. Most steps are optional, but for the sake of completion, of course, we'll go over them. But for the sake of completion, we'll review each one in a bit of detail. First, we define and load a taxonomy. The taxonomy means the definition of all document types that we want to process and all the data that we want extracted from each document type. The next step is the digitization step. In this point, the robot creates an electronic version of the document that can be later used. The classification step means figuring out all the documents and their types that are part of an input file. After classification, we might need to do a bit of a validation if we're not confident that the automatic classifier has done a good enough job. This means we send the classification results to a business user for validation, and then we can reuse those validated results in order to further train our classifiers and improve their performance over time. The next step is the extraction step, where we obviously extract the necessary information from our documents. Just like in the case of the classification, we can also have data validation in the case of extraction. And when using machine learning models for extraction, we can also retrain these with user-validated data in order to improve their results. Last but not least, we of course export the data to make it usable for other processes down the road. Document understanding is a part of an end-to-end automation. It rarely exists as a business process of its own. The documents we want to process don't just pop out of thin air, and the extracted data needs to be utilized by subsequent automation. If we look at it in a complete scenario, we can see the document understanding being a key part where we extract the information. And we have an upstream automation prior to document understanding, where the files to be processed are retrieved, and this would act as a dispatcher for document understanding. Document understanding would then act as a performer by extracting the data and then act as a dispatcher itself for other automations that are making use of the exported data. In order to improve the developer experience when working with document understanding, we're set the goal to create a new document understanding process template that would help everyone get started on document understanding project. We want this template to be suitable for all use cases, from quick demos to scalable implementations. It should fit the bill in each and every situation. We want it to be production ready, which means from an RPA perspective, built-in logging, exception handling, and retry mechanisms. We want a common approach, a common architecture for both attended and unattended implementation. And it's very important to make it easy to switch between solutions. Every so often, it happens that after a successful POC that was developed in attended mode, then we want to go into production in an unattended environment. We designed the template to make the development, testing, scaling as easy as possible. And out of the box, it comes with all the best practices for document understanding, for general RPA processes, and for orchestration processes or log-running workflows. There is, however, a difference in the solution architecture. For those of you familiar with the Irish framework, you know that everything used to run as a batch job. This is no longer the case for document understanding. A job represents the execution of a process on a UiPath robot, if for those of you unfamiliar with the term. And for document understanding, we will have a dedicated job to process every input file. There will be no more batch processing for document understanding jobs. This comes with a big set of benefits, the most important being that this solution, this architecture, meets all the requirements and meets all the best practices. It prevents external issues, external application failures from impacting document understanding, which is very important because we don't want an outside application to trigger re-executions in document understanding, which would lead to unwanted consumption of license pages. And it gives a much better overview of document understanding workload and robot utilization, which obviously makes it very easy to scale up or down depending on the needs. There are restrictions because document understanding processes, well, they will no longer run as batch jobs. So we will have a dedicated job. And this means a dispatcher mechanism or a trigger is required to trigger those jobs. This is not a big problem. It's very easy to implement. However, it is a different approach compared to what we have been used to. But enough theory. Let's have a look at how we do it in practice. And let's move to UiPath Studio. This is how the template looks in UiPath Studio. The main thing you might notice is that we have two main workflows. This is fine. The differences between them are minimal, and they're only related to how human-in-the-loop is handled. Of course, the attended one uses the local classification station and the validation station, while the main action center is designed for unattended use, and all human-in-the-loop activities go through action. Let's have a look at main action center. As I said, the differences are minimal. It takes in two arguments, a string for the target file to be processed and the Boolean whether or not to use orchestrator queues. Of course, if queues are being used, the string argument is being discarded. The framework itself consists on a series of workflows that you will recognize as being a part of the document understanding framework itself. Before going into document processing, of course, we read the config file. This is nothing new. It's the same concept that we've been using for quite a long time in the RE framework. The only difference is that orchestrator assets are not loaded in this step. Once the config file has been read, we do process initialization. This is where we load orchestrator assets, we load the taxonomy, and if your process requires any custom initialization code, this is where you would put it. If queues are being used, we get the transaction item to be processed. Otherwise, we go directly in the digitization step. Here, out of the box, the workflow comes configured with UiPath document OCR, and the only thing you'd need to do is to select the OCR engine of your choice, if needed. Afterwards, it goes to classification, and by default, after classification, all documents will go to human-in-the-loop for validation. Implementing the business rules for deciding whether or not classification validation is needed or not is something process-specific. So it is up to the developer to implement them. Let's have a quick look at the human-in-the-loop part. The workflow creates a document classification action. If queues are being used, we update the transaction progress in order to mark the item as waiting for validation, and then the process suspends while waiting for the action to be completed. Upon resumption, we go and train the classifiers with the user-validated data, and then we go back to the next step, which means process each document. You might remember that I mentioned that as part of the input file, we could have one or more documents. This is why we have a parallel for each loop in here, because we want to process each and every document that comes within our input file. For one input file, we might have an array of classification results, so we are iterating through them. We split our input PDF into smaller subdocuments if needed, and then we extract the data from those logical documents. In the extraction phase, you would just need to go and configure the extractors of your choice. And of course, just like it was the case for classification, you would need to implement the business logic that dictates if human validation is required or not for the extracted data. By default, all extraction data goes through a human in the loop. We create a document data validation action, we update the transaction progress, and we wait for it to be completed. Then the workflow goes through train extractors. Again, this is useful when using machine learning models to extract our data, because we can use the human validated data to further retrain our models. Last but not least, we have the export step. The easiest and most common thing is to just write the extracted data as an Excel file. But of course, this is just one possibility. We can write it to a database. We can make use of UiPath's data service. It is really process dependent. Once the processing of each document completes, we go to an overall end process activity where we do any logic that is required by the individual use case. By default, this is where we only set our transaction status to successful. And that's it. That's all the logic for processing documents. It is very easy to get started, and for everything that you need customized, you just go to the appropriate workflow and do the modification.